What we're talking about today is Census Legacies. And Census Legacies is in some ways a very simple premise. Census 2020 outreach was meaningful in various ways. It was unprecedented in terms of the kinds of investments that were made, not only by philanthropy, which was important, philanthropy at the local and regional level, philanthropy at the statewide level, philanthropy at the national level. It was also important for the kinds of investments that state governments made in many states across the country, as well as the US Census Bureau. We kind of take this for granted that the US Census Bureau invested heavily in community outreach, but they invested much more heavily in community outreach than they had done in the past. So instead of relying on a model where you hire an army of enumerators fanning out across the country and doing non-response follow-up with anyone who did not self-enumerate, the Census Bureau recognized early on that they needed community in order for this to succeed. They needed community not only as trusted messengers, which is important, but also as co-designers of the work. There was so much work that was necessary in terms of outreach before the actual enumeration that the Census Bureau recognized well in advance that they needed to do things differently this year. Of course, because of the pandemic, that work became all the more essential. It was so important for communities to learn so much about the census from people that they knew and trusted, and not just from the federal government, which in many of our communities, we knew that there were high levels of distrust. So there was so much that happened with respect to census work that provided important lessons in terms of how do you build these cross-sectoral coalitions? How do you get philanthropy engaged in a different way in community? And how do you center inclusion and equity? That we think that there are some important lessons to carry forward. In terms of who we are, this is an effort that is in its initial stage. We announced the intention to create a network in mid-September, and you are part of this network that we're building. So we are an emerging network of funders, nonprofits, businesses, government agencies, and census coalitions from around the country that are seeking to repurpose census outreach tables to ensure that historically undercounted communities have an equal voice in shaping the future of our regions. I'll say a little bit about the work in the Inland Empire, which in many ways is a pilot and a demonstration of what is possible when you take census coalitions and continue that work and really deepen the work of inclusion and equity in a regional context. Before I do that, I'll just say a little bit about what inclusive economic development looks like. And I say this from the perspective as the director of the Center for Social Innovation at UCR. We had created an effort called Inland California Rising about 2 years ago. And the goal was to increase investments in inland California and to focus on inclusive economic development. There are different models if you go from north to south in our region in terms of what this looks like. So if you look at Stockton, Reinvent Stockton Foundation was a new institution that was created to support the work of Stockton Mayor Michael Tubbs and his vision of different kinds of investments and innovations to move forward an equity agenda. You may have seen the HBO documentary, Stockton on My Mind, and that includes efforts like the Stockton Scholars Program, their Universal Basic Income experiment, and more. Beyond that, you have these collective impact efforts, and you look at IEGO and Fresno Drive. IEGO is the Inland Economic Growth and Opportunity Project in the Inland Empire, and Fresno Drive is an effort in the greater Fresno region. So it's mostly the city of Fresno and Fresno County in the greater Fresno area. Those efforts pay a lot of attention to equity and inclusive processes. I would say that Fresno, from our observation, has been more inclusive than what we at least initially have seen with IEGO. But in both of those efforts, it's a model in which you get community leaders, systems leaders of various types that come together and try to push a collective agenda. And then community inclusion has had varying degrees of success. By contrast, IRISE, which I'll talk about more and also let our community voices speak for themselves, started with census tables. The intuition when we worked with our census partners was that we had an opportunity, instead of asking, requesting, demanding that community be at the table when important decisions are being made, that we actually build the table from the community out, and that we use census coalitions as the basic building block of how you get this done, and to center it on some key values. So I'm just going to show some video clips from our partners. First, I'm going to show a clip from our education equity partners, and then I'm going to show, actually, I'm going to do that first and then talk a little bit more about IE-RISE, and then show a couple of other reactions from funders and government agency partners in our region.
Life is constantly changing. Education is constantly changing. Needs are constantly changing, and you need the input of people that are experiencing those changes, which are the students. So just being able to just engage them and again take them seriously, bring them to the tables, and allow them to just express what it is that they feel.
For all schools all around, I would say bring in my diversity. And when I mean diversity, I don't mean in the students, I mean with the staff, because it's cool to have friends that look like you, but it's even better to have a teacher that looks like you and understands where you come from and all the other fun stuff.
Oh, the assets, man! There are so many assets in the Inland Empire. Above everything else, I would say that students living in the Inland Empire have just grit. They have everything that they need to be successful. It just takes somebody behind them to give them that extra push. They have dedication. They just need motivation.
The youth of the Inland Empire, they are resilient, they are gritty, they are smart, they are brilliant, and they just need to be ignited because they bring so much to the table and they just need that igniting to set forth.
I think if we all individually, intentionally focus on having a better tomorrow for our youth, then we'll start to see some growth and some, really inspiring stories coming out of the Inland Empire.
So that's an example from education, from education equity. More generally, why did our community build this coalition called IE-RISE? And again, it's an acronym. It's the Inland Empire Roadmap for an Inclusive and Sustainable Economy. We recognize that momentum is building in the Inland Empire. There are many powerful coalitions that have emerged over the last decade to coordinate in a particular region, like the Coachella Valley region of the Inland Empire, or around a particular issue, for example, in terms of immigrant rights. What census outreach allowed was for organizations to test the power of collective organizing on a macro level, at a regional level, across issues to great success. There's a strong desire in the region to maintain the best parts of the census while staying true to the work ahead. So what we've done, we planted the seeds of this idea, we meaning our census leaders, so our center, the civic engagement table primarily, and the coalition around it, seeded this idea. And it's something that we've been thinking about for a while. We saw census as important not only for making sure that everyone counted, but to make sure that we would build a stronger foundation for the next decade. So what we've done from June through September was had a series of convenings. It was challenging to do it in the context of the pandemic, but when we had these listening sessions with dozens of partners in each of the issue areas that we identified, time and again, when we asked people, what is giving you hope during this challenging time? Remember, it was not only about COVID, it was also in the wake of George Floyd and the global movement for racial justice. People said that being able to come together in this way, not only on census, but even what they saw in terms of pandemic response, to have this community up kind of organizing for systemic change, really gave them inspiration. And so what we did over the summer is go through a visioning exercise and to kind of boil down what IE-RISE meant. And so this is what the community came up with. IE-RISE is a 2 countywide collaborative that works towards amplifying community voices around a unified vision and activating shared values to reform systems in order to make them truly equitable. The goals are to set new expectations for the region, to create a unified community vision for the next decade, to influence long-term planning and collective power building across sectors and subregions. By the way, this region is 27,000 square miles and has 4.6 million residents, just to give you a size of the scale of what we're talking about. Also to engage in policy development and making investment recommendations that advance a shared vision, to build relationships with key allies to advance policy and systems change work, and then finally to change the narrative in terms of what's possible for a region like the Inland Empire. In terms of the systems change framework, what our community partners did is we workshopped the idea of the conditions of systems change that FSG had developed, looking at investments by foundations like the California Endowment and others. And what they did is, first of all, flipped it, noting that mental models, changing mindsets, was in some ways, the most important thing to do because so many other things are dependent on the kind of mindsets that people carry. There was also a recognition that while policy change is important, it wasn't the only thing that mattered. It was also important to change practices, to change resource flows, and also to change power dynamics in our region, as well as relationships, right? So relationships go beyond power dynamics because it's not just about who has power in terms of controlling what resource and over what decision and what practices. It's also the kinds of relationships that may or may not exist that either facilitate or inhibit community partners from having influence in terms of how resources are allocated, how policies are passed, or what practices that government agencies enact. What our partners also said was that while the FSG model was important, what was missing was community voice. Even though you could go through that model and see that community is part of the system, many funders and other decision makers don't think of community as system players. So our community partners thought it was important to also lift up the importance of community voice, to be seen as legitimate, to be seen as expert voices in the problems and the solutions at hand. It was also important for us as a coalition to lift up shared values. And what that meant was these are values that are not only shared among traditional service providers or advocacy groups or power builders, but those that are shared with allies in government agencies, shared with people in the business community, and shared more generally in society. So the shared values that our region came up with, and we're going through this not to say that every region needs to do this, but this is a kind of visioning exercise in terms of what the core values are that can be so helpful in terms of turning a new page, whether it be in a region, whether it be at the state level, potentially at the national level as well. So the shared values that our partners lifted up were inclusion, sustainability, and equity. And we have come up with a draft on how would you measure progress on these values? How would you measure progress on indicators of inclusion, of sustainability, and equity? We also have through lines across various issues. So gender justice, racial justice, and LGBTQ justice, equity regardless of status or ability, and then to ensure that youth voices are included. So if you go, we have, I don't know if I know recently that there was a server reboot that our main community partner in IRISE was working on. So I'm not sure if that website is up right now, but there you will see the larger framework that exists. We had a soft launch of IRISE. It was a funder briefing in late September. I just want to share with you a perspective from one of the funders in our region, the Weingart Foundation, that has been investing in the Inland Empire and Southern California more generally for decades and focuses a lot on capacity building and equity. So this is Patty Watkins, who is a senior program officer in the Weingart Foundation.
That I heard a lot this morning that really inspired me and continue to give me hope. And that's the work of IRISE and what you all are about to embark upon together. I think this is really bold. This is really bold, ambitious, and courageous work, as it should be. What you are trying to do here is to dismantle structural racism and really build a more equitable society for all of us to be able to to thrive. So yes, it is bold. Yes, it is ambitious. And yes, it is courageous. All of those things are required here. That is what inspires me. That is what, yes, I dare say excites me about what's happening right now in the Inland Empire. I don't think that, I want to talk to leadership right now of IE Rise and just say that, you all have brought all the right partners to the table. And you may not have all the right answers or all the answers at this point, but it is your commitment to really learning that to me truly inspires me.
So the Weingart Foundation, by the way, was a significant funder for a pooled fund on census outreach in our region that was held under the Inland Empire Community Foundation. And the Inland Empire Community Foundation was also the ACBO that was receiving the state government dollars. So it's a really remarkable example of how our community came together, funders as well as community partners, to make sure that the mix of public and private dollars was under one entity and being used in the most effective way possible, depending on the constraints that the funding was attached to.
But I heard a lot.
Next, I want to highlight this example and its excerpts of some remarks that Dwayne Baker, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the San Bernardino County Transportation Authority, made, just to show the kind of example of what is possible. Now, I recognize that not everyone is going to sound like Dwayne. We were pleasantly surprised in terms of how significantly the SBCTA showed up not only on census, but in the inclusion and equity work post-census. So I'll just let Dwayne share, I'll share a few of his remarks here.
Good morning. My name is Dwayne Baker. I'm the Deputy Executive Director of the San Bernardino County Transportation Authority and the Council of Governments as well. Look, transportation planning, transportation infrastructure construction in the past has been used and built in ways that have divided and disrupted communities of color. Prime example of that was over 50 years ago when the 215 freeway was constructed through San Bernardino. It was like a great wall, isolating and separating communities from the central commercial core of San Bernardino. Matter of fact, the ramps on that freeway all went to the east, none to the west. When we did the widening project for that freeway recently, we tried to rectify that and reconnect the east and west sides of those communities. But that's an example of how, in the past, errors have been made. Recently, the San Bernardino County Board of Supervisors passed a resolution declaring racism as a public health crisis. And my organization is using this time as an opportunity to look at how transportation decisions are made and also to ensure that we are not repeating the errors of the past and are serving our communities, all of our communities. Now, looking forward, we are excited about several projects to bring cleaner transportation to our region. However, with all this good work, there is still hard work ahead of us. And a prime example of that is a proposal that we found out about in sort of a roundabout way, but it's related to the California High-Speed Rail Authority, and it's a project that you probably all heard about to bring high-speed rail from the northern portion of our state down here to Southern California. There's an environmental clearance going on right now for a portion of that, from Los Angeles Union Station to the transit station in Anaheim. And in order to make that work, what they are proposing is the construction of a brand new freight rail yard in the city of Colton. And the idea is that they would build this, the railroad would build this new freight yard in Colton and bring all the freight traffic from the corridor in Los Angeles and Orange County and put it in the Inland Empire with all the associated truck traffic that goes along with that. Of course, we think that without further study and without further mitigation, that this is not necessarily a proper plan, and we are trying to fight for the rights of our community to make sure that it's taken into consideration. Where they're proposing this rail yard, by the state's own measurement, is some of the most economically disadvantaged communities in the state of California. And I think that this mindset that really whatever jobs we can send to the Inland Empire is fine and they'll accept them is wrong thinking. And we need to try to educate folks about having good jobs in the Inland Empire and not already burdening an overburdened community with air pollution and congestion issues. And so we're working hard on that. And that's why we're excited to continue the work that began with the outreach associated with the census. As a Council of Governments, we were involved with that work, and we are happy to be involved with the work of IRISE to help make sure that we are being more inclusive in how we plan and build transportation projects that serve everyone. Good morning.
So, we quoted Dwayne there at length, but you can see why and how powerful that is. It was not only the work of census, but also how it then, when you have government agencies that do more collaborative work with community at an equal footing, then when you have things like George Floyd, when you have, the resolution that San Bernardino County Board of Supervisors passed declaring racism a public health crisis. If any of you know about San Bernardino County, it would not have been the first county in California. You would not have thought of that as the first county in California to do that. But it's the kind of partnerships that have been built over the past few years with a very conservative board that ended up passing it. Those boards had also ended up unanimously passing resolutions on census and agreeing to work together and our center and community partners on an equal setting. So the work going ahead, at least the way we see it in general, going beyond the Inland Empire, is the opportunity to build on the foundation of census coalitions to create stronger and more equitable communities, to ensure that regional solutions are built from the bottom up, not top down, with cross-sector collaborations that honor the expertise of community members and community serving organizations. In terms of the strategy and approach that we are thinking about for Census Legacies as a network is to have a kind of federated structure with metro and regional census tables and these cross-regional networks that can grow out of that. So Carla used to be, as we mentioned, the lead partner specialist coordinator for the US Census Bureau in Riverside County. She had also done a lot of work in San Bernardino County. Using those connections that she had made with Imperial County, San Diego, and Orange, we have reached out first across those working, formerly for the US Census Bureau, but also community partners and philanthropic partners in all of these counties. And I'm happy to say that Southern California is pretty strongly organized at this point, but it's not just about California. We have gotten interest from the Florida Philanthropic Network, from the State Census Equity Fund in New York State. We've also gotten connected with the Coalition of Urban Indian Centers, which is national. So these are the different kinds of networks that we are pulling together. Key elements of the network and the work involve peer learning, including an innovation exchange and an idea exchange, peer support, technical assistance, and mentoring, and we're happy to answer that in the Q&A. We're in the process of developing a toolkit that you can find on our website, censuslegacies.org. Here are some of the key talking points. One, this notion of trusted messengers was so key to census outreach, and it can translate into so many other types of issues and activities that are relevant at the regional level and at the statewide level. Trusted messengers, including community-based organizations that are service providers and advocacy groups, are essential because they can reach populations that government cannot reach. Trust in government, whether it be the federal government, state government, or even local government, as we found with census, trust is low, and it varies according to partisanship, depending on who is in power at what level. So one key talking point is that we need to continue to invest in the trusted messengers of census. Two, community input needs to be all inclusive. It is not sufficient for someone to just check off a box to say that they consulted with one or two organizations and thereby got their community input, or to say that they had a public hearing and thereby got their community input. It's important to use the kinds of inclusive tables that were built through census to make sure that communities of color, immigrant communities, LGBTQ communities, people with disabilities, veterans, those serving the 0 to 5 population, and many more, all of those quote unquote hard to count or historically undercounted communities have traditionally not been included in decision making, whether it be economic decision making, regional planning, or public health response. It is important as a talking point here, as a key principle, that communities are included. And then finally, the third talking point is that it is important to have co-designed solutions with community organizations as equal partners. It's not simply a matter to engage the community once most of the contours of a solution have been found. These are the key insights of human-centered design and community-centered design. And what this means is that community organizations are not only advocates, but they are experts in their own right. And that expertise needs to be recognized by philanthropy, by government agencies, and other decision makers. Some of the key principles that we have that we're sketching out for our toolkit include a commitment to inclusion, and again, inclusion of all historically undercounted and underrepresented communities, a commitment to equity, and then finally, a commitment to systems change. And we can talk more in the Q&A about what that means, but systems change is not just about servicing a problem, and it's not just about power building. It's about transforming the systems. We had shown one particular framework. Not every region has to tackle every aspect of the system the way the Inland Empire is doing, but it is a bolder and more ambitious vision. Key to that systems change work is cross-sector collaboration. So at the very least, to include not only community organizations, but one other partner, be it philanthropy, be it government agencies, be it research partners, et cetera. That's part of what makes something a census legacy rather than business as usual. And then finally, the recognition of community expertise by those outside of community spaces. Some of the key partners that can be included, and this will vary according to the region or community and how the work of census had proceeded. So these include nonprofit service providers, civic engagement and power building groups, funders, government agencies, legislative committees. If you're talking about it at the state level, we're happy to note that in the state of California, we've gotten significant interest and support from within the legislature already for this idea. Academic partners can also be important, especially if they were involved in census work. Other evaluation and research partners, right? Evaluators are important not only as independent entities, but also those who are in that process of collaborative learning. And then finally, COVID-19 recovery coalitions have sprouted up. In some places, they've come out of census tables. In other places, it's involved some combination of census tables as well as other types of organizations that have gotten involved. In terms of possible activities, these can include economic development to make sure that the work moving forward is inclusive, sustainable, and equitable. Regional planning, so this includes housing, transportation, and land use, but also water management and air quality management. Public health response, including delivery of the vaccine. What census has taught us is that you cannot rely on a model in which it's the federal government coming in with their army of employees and getting the community to cooperate from the get-go. Surveys right now indicate that upwards of 1/2 of the population is reluctant to take an FDA-approved vaccine at no cost. Now that might change and that percentage might increase to something like 80%. But we know that for herd immunity, we need to be well upwards of the 90s, probably above 95% in order for that to be successful. Guess who you need to count on? You need to count on those trusted messengers. So instead of just coming up with these ad hoc coalitions of community partners time and again, we are hopeful that we can use census legacy tables as important building blocks for the work of public health response moving forward. Redistricting, of course, redistricting is something that people immediately think of as post-census work, and that's important this year as it has been in prior decades. One potential innovation here is that we can do a lot more in terms of making sure that communities have a say not only in the drawing of maps, but even literally in how they define themselves as communities of interest, and then how they engage and activate when it comes to the redistricting process. And then finally, At the local and regional level, we also have an opportunity to evaluate the efficacy of census coalitions and outreach in being better prepared for Census 2030. We have heard from many partners that the important lessons of Census 2010, even though there wasn't much funding behind it, there were some important lessons learned that just got lost. People literally were not preserving the kinds of documents that were going to be helpful for Census 2020 outreach. So at the very least, we can have a kind of learning and evaluation component and a document preservation component to be better prepared for Census 2030. Part of being better prepared for Census 2030 is to have a stronger community by 2030. At the state level, many of the points that have been made at the local and regional level also apply at the state level. They just get aggregated up. State coalitions, whether by funders or community organizations, can coordinate the state and local work that might be happening in terms of census legacy work. And then finally, in terms of national partners, you can aggregate that up from regions to states to national. Quite independent of that, there's also a role for national partners to advocate on the American Community Survey in different ways. First of all, to reduce disparities in response rates. We can also think about innovative steps that can be taken to take corrective action to improve on whatever gaps in the decennial in the self-response that national advocacy groups can get involved in. And then there could be other kinds of innovations to improve the American Community Survey, as well as other innovations more broadly at a national level to help serve disenfranchised communities. I'm going to stop there and turn off my screen share. Carla, who is on this call, is the Associate Director of our center, as well as for Census Legacies. And as I'd mentioned before, Carla comes to us from the census. And we know that the US Census Bureau has been thinking about post-census work, with a lot of details still to be filled out in terms of the new administration and what those priorities might be. We are hoping to get philanthropy and community organized because Census Legacies is too important to just leave to the federal government alone. We have an incredible opportunity here to make sure that we build more inclusive, sustainable, and equitable communities. You can find out more. You can follow us on LinkedIn, as well as we have a contact form on Census Legacies.